Hello, welcome to another edition of Data in the Hallway. I'm the host, Ray Pei, Community Manager at PingCAP, joined by my colleague Daniel, beaming in from, I assume you're home near Amsterdam, but I'm
Yes,
not sure if
indeed.
you're
Near
traveling.
Amsterdam.
Cool. All right. And honored to have our guest, Don Foster, who is a Director of Data Science at the Chaos Project. Nice to see you wearing all the Chaos swag items on your shirt and your earrings. So it's good to have you on. And the topic today, I think, in particular, the last couple of years, there's been a lot of discussion about open source companies and projects like relicensing, forks that result from that, and what kind of impact it's on the community. And I mean, Don, I think you've been looking at this. I mean, you're looking at metrics in general, but you've been looking at this discussion for a while, and you even have a repo, which I'll add in the podcast description, of a repo of I think 19 projects that changed their licenses over the past 10 years or so. So, Don, first of all, welcome. First of all, feel free to introduce yourself. I mean, briefly describe your title and where you are, but also tell people a little bit about the Chaos Project for people who don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been working in open source for a very long time, 25 plus years. So I've been doing this for quite a while. I worked at a number of companies like Intel, Puppet, VMware. I've also spent some time on the research side. So I took a little diversion from my midlife crisis and went back to school and got a PhD where I studied the Linux kernel and looked at how people collaborate within the kernel. So I have kind of this combination practitioner researcher background. And then most recently, I've been working full time for the Chaos Project. So I've been involved in Chaos for quite a long time, and in metrics even longer than the Chaos Project has existed. But right now, I am focused on data science for the Chaos Project. And the Chaos Project itself stands for Community Health Analytics for Open Source Software. So Chaos with two S's. And we are really pretty focused on looking at how you can measure data about open source projects with an eye toward making improvements. So on the one hand, on the contribution side, how do you look at metrics and data with an eye toward improving the open source projects that you contribute to? As well as taking a look at the consumption side. So as an organization or as an individual, how do you look at the viability and the risks and other dynamics associated with the projects that you consume? So the projects maybe that you have in your infrastructure or that you're building your products on top of. So we tend to look at open source in lots of different ways and open source metrics, but with an eye towards making improvements and getting better insights around the work that we do in open source.
Cool. Yeah, I've been fortunate to be involved in. I mean, obviously not as active as Don is in the Chaos Project. If you love open source and if you love metrics, this is a place to be with a lot of good people too. And then Don, I mean, you mentioned the academic side. What I also like about the community is that you have a lot of researchers and academics who bring a very different perspective versus like practitioners like myself. So I really enjoy whenever I have a chance to interact with Chaos community members. It's usually a pretty interesting discussion. So yeah, I mean, let's sort of talk about software or open source project relicensing. I mean, there's been I think like even in database spaces, like you have companies like Redis and like a Cockroach DB that's been in the news recently. I mean, so first of all, like, why did you decide to? I mean, I'm glad you have this list because, like, when people ask, like, how many big major, I mean, you're not going to cover all the projects. You're basically listing all the major projects over the past decade or so that have relicensed. Like, why did you feel it was important to like create this list and maintain it?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started getting more and more fascinated with this whole relicensing dynamic because, well, so let's back up a little bit. So relicensing has become more of a phenomenon just in the past, maybe 5 or so years. And in a lot of cases, these companies are single vendor open source projects. So they're projects where a company has built their entire company around a few or a single open source project. And they're getting pressure from their investors, their stakeholders, their shareholders to make money. And one of the ways that they are being pressured to make money is to relicense some of these open source projects, which in a lot of cases they can do because people have signed contributor license agreements and other things that allow them to relicense some of these open source projects and effectively make them proprietary technologies. So they're getting a lot of pressure from from their investors, in a lot of cases VCs, or some of these are public companies, so shareholders, to relicense. And so it's become super interesting to me. And I originally created this list because I was thinking, how can we maybe do some really interesting statistical models or something around these relicenses and maybe be able to predict them. What we've found, and looking at this more realistically, is this is a list that we've maintained that has about 19 projects on it that have relicensed. And that's just not enough, right? So there are loads of projects that would fit the exact same format as these that never will relicense. So statistically speaking, it's such a rare event that you can't really predict it. So what I've done is I've sort of shifted my mindset because this is still really interesting. And so I've started looking at some of these that have generated or have resulted in forks. So they relicensed, and the result has been a fork of these projects. So what I've started digging into is some of the forks, and so we're working on a little research project within the Chaos project to look at a few case studies. So we have in that repository that you mentioned that'll be linked in the show notes. Right now, we've built out at least organizational affiliation data for 6 projects. So we've looked at Elasticsearch and the fork OpenSearch, Redis and the fork Valkey, Terraform and the fork OpenTofu. And so we've looked at the contributions that have been made by different companies, different employees at different companies, and how that dynamic works. And so that's what we've shifted the focus of the research on, is some of these case studies to better understand the implications that happen when someone relicenses and it results in a fork. And I can
Cool,
talk more
cool.
about
No,
those
no, no, no. That
later.
Yeah, no, it's that's great. So yeah, I mean, as like you mentioned, there are a couple of things there that I want to talk to. I guess, like, since 2018, I've been working. I've had 3 different jobs at company-based open source projects, and uh, over the past couple of years, because I start to wonder myself, especially last year when things were really awful in terms of job market, companies like relicensing, and not just relicensing, like companies that were at the forefront of open source, just getting rid of whole like open source teams. And it made me really wonder, is there a fundamental shift happening? And it made me feel like somewhat insecure.
Mhm.
Fortunately for companies like GitLab and like now at PingCAP and TiDB, we have founders that are firmly committed to open source. Have made public statements and comments, but still, it sort of made me wonder: are we a rarity here? But like you noted, it's kind of a rare instance. Like over the past decade, there's only been like a 19 major ones. So that gives me, I mean, some level of comfort. I mean, there are plenty. I'm writing a blog post about this too. Hopefully, it'll go out in a few weeks. There are plenty of other companies that are staying the path in open source despite all the headlines you're reading. And the other thing I want to point out, I think this is something that Don, you mentioned. Companies that have been in the news recently, like a SourceGraph and CockroachDB, they actually changed their licenses like 5, 6 years ago to business
Mhm.
source license. I think both from Apache too. So this isn't. they made tweaks to making their repos private, which isn't great. Making changes or restricting their core offerings, but that has really nothing to do with like licensing. Like the licensing change was done like 5, 6 years ago, so this isn't necessarily new. So obviously, I'm a big fan of open source. I mean, so is Daniel. So I think we're still in very good company, and hopefully, a lot more companies will be in our space. So
Yeah, and I think
yeah.
one of the interesting dynamics, and it's so you mentioned that people are still some of the founders of some of these companies are big proponents of open source and have said publicly that they won't change their license. Well, that's what happened with Redis, right? Because the founder of Redis had always said it will always be open source. We're never going to change the license. And then, he left the company and was not in charge anymore. And sure enough, the license changed.
Right.
And, we also get things like, you look at company acquisitions, right? So some of the
Hmm.
early forks were a result of Sun being acquired by Oracle and people being, on the case of, the MySQL side, some of the folks not being convinced that Oracle would be a good steward of it. And so, they went off and created MariaDB. Oracle effectively shut down the open office team, and they took it and created the document foundation and created LibreOffice as the fork of open office. So this forking phenomenon has existed for a long time as a result of things that happen that the community is not particularly happy with. And so the relicensing is just the latest iteration of this. But it can also happen, we've seen some disruption in even some foundation-owned open source projects as a result of the Broadcom acquisition of VMware,
Hmm.
for example. So you really never know what's going to happen with some of these projects because things change, situations change. Founders are no longer at the company, and it's really hard to take people at their word, right? So
Hmm.
it's interesting too. If you look at Redis, it had loads of contributions from people outside of the company. And I think a big part of that was because they had said that they'll always be open source. They were a lot more community focused until they weren't, right? And then there was a relicense, and and the contributors that had been contributing to Redis for years took it and created Valkey under the Linux Foundation. So in that case, it was very much the contributors were unhappy with this decision, and they took it on their own and created a fork, which is how I've tended to think about forks traditionally. That those tended to be the ones that were successful, where the contributors kind of took it and went in a different direction. But what's interesting to me about some of these relicensed projects is that they don't have a community of contributors. So if you look at, and this data is actually in the notebooks in the repository, you can see the data for Elasticsearch and for Terraform. They have almost no contributions from people outside of the companies that drive those particular projects. So the impact when they relicensed was not on this community of contributors who became upset and took it and forked it. It was on the users. So the users were really impacted by these relicensing decisions. And so in the case of Elasticsearch, AWS, Amazon was really impacted by this decision to relicense. So they took it as users and forked it into OpenSearch, even though they didn't have any people who had um, they didn't have any community contributors coming over with it. They happened to have one person who had left Elastic before and who had contributed to Elasticsearch involved in the project. But that wasn't him moving to AWS because of this. It was he worked at AWS and ended up working on this OpenSearch project as well. And I don't know what kind of decisions this one individual was involved in any of the decisions to fork it, but it was really a user decision, a user impact, as opposed to a contributor impact. So it's interesting to look at these different types of projects and the relicensing and the different types of forks that you end up with as a result.
Yeah, I think that often after having forked, the license can't be changed easily anymore because the contributor license agreement is only for the original project. So usually the forks are kind of forced to stay open source, which might be a good thing. Another interesting project that did a relicense, but in a completely different way, is OpenSSL. So OpenSSL, like a few years back, changed its license the Apache license because it wasn't really compatible with the GPL. And then they had to change their license, and I think that was a major undertaking because the issues with the contributor license agreement, because they didn't really have one, but they wanted to make it more friendly for open source. I think that worked out really well in the end, but it was a major undertaking.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you think people should be careful when signing contributor license agreements, or how do you think people should be handling that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I for the most part am kind of anti-contributor license agreement, unsurprisingly. And I do have a strong preference for developer certificate of origin, which is the signed off by process. But I do understand companies' desires to have contributor license agreements. I first went to Puppet, and this was in 2015. I started working for them. And it was interesting. So I started as the community manager, and I talked to basically all of our engineers, what problems do you have in the community? What do you think I should work on? How can I help? And what came up across the board was they had this terrible process for a contributor license agreement that was disconnected from GitHub. Nobody knew who had signed it. This was before we had just, CLA bots in GitHub, and it was really easy. And so my initial thinking was, great, let's just get rid of it. And I talked to our founder, Luke Kanice, and he was like, yeah, let's do that, but let's talk to some people first. And what we decided, we actually ended up keeping it and writing our own CLA bot. That's kind of beside the point. But we ended up keeping the contributor license agreement because there was a concern that there would be a perception that if we didn't have a contributor license agreement, that we maybe weren't as serious about the open source project as a company that did have a contributor license agreement because it gave you a paper trail. So the idea was, eventually if Puppet went IPO or got acquired, that this could affect the valuation of the company. And we decided to keep it. It wasn't a particularly heavy CLA, and Puppet, as far as I know, never relicensed or did anything nefarious with it. So, I think in some cases if you want to contribute to the project, you're kind of stuck with it. You don't really have a lot of choice for the projects that use a CLA. If you really need to contribute to that project, you're going to have to sign the CLA. And so it puts developers and companies, I think, in a tough position because you really don't have a lot of choice, sadly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the challenge, right? Because I mean, you only have two options. Either you sign and contribute, or you don't contribute at all, which is, I mean, it definitely puts people in the rough spot. And I think both of you noted now it's gotten so easier. It's almost like, you upgrade your OS on your phone, you accept whatever agreement without really reading it because you check the box because they ask you to check the box, and you don't. I don't think 90+% of the people really understand the implications of that. So, I mean, we're kind of veering off the topic, but yeah, I prefer DCO too, but the nuance and the differences between DCO and CLA. Actually, GitLab is like one of the companies. I mean, this happened before I joined. They changed to DCL just to make it more friendly towards like developers. But I don't think most people like really understand the difference. They just want to like contribute and without really understanding the legal implications of that, right? So yeah, cool. Yeah, so I mean, Don, I think you sort of touched on that about your upcoming research. I think I knew you were going to cover Elasticsearch and Redis, but it looks like you're covering like a Terraform as well. Like, so what aspect of the community health are you trying to like address in your research? Um,
Yes,
yeah.
that's a good question. So right
Mhm.
now, So far we've focused entirely on organizational affiliation because I think that that's a good baseline for what's going on in the community and who's contributing. So that's the piece that we have the research for now. But there are a few of us who are working on, well, we're kind of doing it as a chaos community, so anyone can participate, but we're looking at creating a research report about these case studies and about the data that we have. And so the idea is to take this organizational affiliation understanding as a starting point and then use various chaos metrics to look at these projects and look in more depth at the community health for some of these projects. And we haven't decided exactly which metrics we're going to look at. We're still trying to decide that. Ideally, I'd love to base that on research. So, research, other academic papers have said that, this is important from a community health aspect, because of this, and look at some of those metrics. What I'm going to be careful about is not necessarily comparing the projects to each other as much as just trying to understand what happened before or after certain events. So, you can't really, like, these are very different projects, right? You can't necessarily compare, a Redis with a Terraform necessarily. So I'm not going to compare them that way, but I want to look at the changes. So what happened in Elasticsearch before the relicense? What happened after the relicense? Were there any changes? Honestly, I suspect in Elasticsearch's case that there really, really aren't going to be any changes because there was just employees contributing before. I'm really interested to do this for Redis because it's very different because the people outside of Redis who were contributing, they all moved to Valkey. There are now only just a very small handful of people who are contributing to Redis who don't work for the company. And it's, a couple of commits here and there. It's not significant chunks of code. So I'm really interested to look at this dynamic. And then, from an open-source standpoint, what happens when it was contributed to the Linux Foundation? So this was an AWS project for several years. And then they just announced at the Open Source Summit in Vienna in September that they had contributed it to the Linux Foundation. So I'll be really interested to look at OpenSearch, here's when it was owned by Amazon, and now that it's been moved into the Linux Foundation, are there any changes based on that? So the idea is to look at kind of general community health measurements. We just haven't quite picked the individual ones. And there's also some other interesting research happening outside of the work that we're doing in the Chaos Project. But RedMonk, for example, Rachel Stevens did a blog post, and we'll link it in the show notes if I haven't already. And she did a blog post about the financial outcomes as a result of these relicensing decisions. And now, granted, it's a very small number of projects that you can look at because it has to be companies that are public, where the financials are public. But what she found was that there really isn't a big impact from a financial standpoint on these companies. So they've relicensed, they've damaged their reputations, they've done all of this work. Like, relicensing something isn't easy, right? And for little to no financial impact as far as anybody can tell. So this is really concerning. And I was just a week or so ago, I was presenting at an Open UK research event along with James Governor, who's also works at RedMonk and is close to Rachel, who did this research. And what he said is that now they've had at least one company come to them and say, hey, we were thinking about relicensing, but we saw what happened to Valkey with Valkey and Terraform Redis and Valkey. And maybe that's not such a good idea anymore. Can you talk us through some of the things that we should be thinking about? And ultimately, they decided not to relicense as a result of some of the concerns with what happens when you relicense these projects. So if you'd asked me, I don't know, 2 months ago, I would have said that, I would expect to see a lot more of this relicensing happening in the future. And now, based on that conversation with James at RedMonk, I'm not sure. I mean, I'm hoping that companies will rethink these decisions to relicense in light of the the outcomes that can happen and the forks that can result.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, that's actually fascinating. I'd love to see that report because I think, when we started talking about this podcast a couple of months ago about your research, I think I kind of mentioned in passing it would be nice to see a report when somebody did a financial analysis of what happened to companies like CockroachDB or anybody else after changing their license from OSI approved licenses to like BSL. Yeah, it's pretty fascinating, and uh, yeah, obviously we weren't there. Like we weren't in the board meetings, like we weren't in the executive meetings, so we don't know what all caused them to change their licenses. But if financial implications is one of them, it didn't really make a huge difference. But at the same time, unfortunately, damage their reputation with the community. So yeah, I mean, I look forward. I'll be sure to link that, and I myself will be very interested um, in reading the report as well. So I mean, I'm not going to hold anybody to this, like you or Daniel, like because it helps me wonder: is it for what we've seen in the past couple of years, is this going to change, or is this going to pendulum going to swing back to somewhat of a normalcy where people calm down and rethink about? I mean, because of what we've seen with Valky and others, like would they think twice about relicensing because all the backlash and other factors?
Yeah, I certainly hope that they will start thinking twice about that. I
Yeah,
do expect, I think we'll still see some more relicensing because I think
right,
that a lot of companies are under a lot of pressure.
right.
And relicensing seems like it might be a way to generate more revenue. Especially as companies are looking at these big cloud providers who are making all the money, and the people who are working on the project aren't making as much of the money, and so there are concerns about who's making the money on these open source projects. And like you said, we're not in the boardroom for those decisions, and they're complicated decisions with lots of different factors. So
Mm,
I would expect to continue to see some relicensing of projects. I suspect that we'll see fewer examples that look like Redis, where they have this big community of contributors. I think we'll see fewer of those relicensing. But these companies that already make all of the contributions, they aside from maybe a reputational hit, I don't know that they get a lot of impact on the of relicensing. Aside from impact to the users, it's hard
mm.
for the users of these projects when relicense happens.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean oh, go ahead, Daniel. Sorry.
I think also like relicensing is one of the options that companies are considering. One of the other options is to like switch to an open core model where, for example, you only get the basic database, and for like extra security or backup and restore, you just have to pay for the enterprise version. I think things should be complete and in the open source version as well. So I'm hoping that they don't relicense and don't switch to open core. But on the other hand, some of the open source project really needs to get some funding from somewhere. So I'm hoping that whoever is using these projects, if it's a cloud provider or a company directly, that they somehow also make sure that they pay back to the project that they're using.
Yeah, and it's a really difficult situation that these companies are in, right? Because if let's just say Elastic isn't successful and they go out of business, that will effectively tank projects like Elasticsearch and Kibana because no one else is contributing to those. So yes, someone could fork it and they could do like what AWS did with OpenSearch and OpenSearch dashboards. But it puts these companies in a tough spot. So if they don't do something to improve their financials, they could go out of business, in which case the open source project would die anyways. So it's a really tough decision, I think, without necessarily right and wrong answers. It's incredibly nuanced, and I do feel for these companies that are put in these positions.
Yeah. And I one thing I was going to mention, like you both of you may have seen this too, like companies like Sentry.io, they're experimenting with like a new type of business source license, right? They I think they call it fair source license. So it's just like BSL, but there's a timestamp. After 2 years, the license reverts to like MIT or Apache 2. I can't remember which one it was. But when I first read it, I mean, well, this doesn't look very different from like a business source licenses that I've seen. And I think I've seen blog posts to that similar effect, but uh, I'm sure we'll see more like experiments and people trying out different things and see how it works out in the next several years. Cool. So yeah, I think I mean, unless Don, you have anything else you wanna talk about in your research, I think I've gone through all the questions that I had on my list. But
Yeah, I think we covered the major points. I think.
cool, awesome. So the last question we have, this is a tradition that we have for all of our guests. We have guests from all over the world, which is very typical of open source, good open source community. I think you're the first guest, believe it or not, from the that are based in the UK. So I know you. I forget the name of the town. You live outside of London. Tell us about your town and tell us that's something interesting that people may not know about.
Yeah, so I live in a small city called Hemel Hempstead that is just north of London. So it's not in London, it's a small city outside of London that's existed since the 8th century. We have a Norman era church from like, I don't know, 10,000, 11,000, and connections to Henry VIII. So it's a town with lots of history. But what a lot of people know us for is something that we call a magic roundabout. And there are very few of these in the UK. The other famous one is in Swindon. And these roundabouts, so normally roundabouts, you always go, I guess it's clockwise around them. And this one is a big roundabout with 6 small roundabouts within it. So you go around each of those teeny tiny roundabouts as a part of going around the big roundabout. And because it's a bunch of teeny tiny roundabouts, you can go around it either way. So you can go clockwise or anti-clockwise, I guess counterclockwise, I think is what you say in the US. And so you can go around it either way. And so this presents not just, foreigners like me who had to, relearn how to drive here, find it confusing, but people who have lived in the UK their entire lives come up against this roundabout and just don't know what to do or how to get around it. And so it's super confusing and super interesting. And any friends that come to visit me, I always make sure that we drive through the magic roundabout at least once because it's an experience.
Wow, Magic Roundabout. That's uh I guess yeah, I guess you shouldn't I guess I shouldn't drive through there when I first land in Heathrow when I'm barely awake. It's not a good thing to do.
No.
No. Yeah, because I mean roundabout is for Americans it's you don't see that very often in the US first of all. And then uh the shock of driving on the other side of the road and add the chaos at the roundabout. Yeah, it's something. But this one, you sent me a Wikipedia page. I was looking at the photo. I'm going, holy cow! Like, I mean, are there a lot of accidents in that roundabout, or not? People just know how to drive through there. But
Surprisingly, I've never seen an accident in there. I'm
okay,
sure they happen, but I don't think it's that people know what they're doing. I think it's that
uh,
people are very careful when they go through it because the
okay,
assumption is that other people won't know what they're doing. So every time I
right,
drive through it, I'm pretty careful to watch what other people are doing and be cautious about people that might not be following the rules. So I think
right,
people are pretty careful, with the exception of the
okay.
taxi drivers. I've been through it in a taxi and they just fly through
All right,
it.
they just zip through. Cool. Nice. In some ways, this kind of sounds like open source communities. You think it's not going to work, but somehow it does. It all kind of comes together.
Totally. That is
So,
exactly how it works.
cool. Awesome. Well, Don, it was great having you on our episode, and looking forward to your research. And hope to see you again in one of the open source conferences in the conferences in the next few months. So,
Yeah, and I will put in a very quick
yeah,
plug because
yeah,
Stephen Wally and I are going to present this data at the Linux Foundation Member Summit in November. So we are going
okay,
to start presenting some of this data. And I did include a link in the show notes of where I presented it a couple of weeks ago at
right,
the Open UK event. So,
right,
and I hope to do more details once we've got more of the project health measurements and do some of that at upcoming conferences.
cool. All right, definitely look forward to that. Well, thanks very much, Don, and have a good evening in the UK.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Bye.
Thank you.